Good afternoon, everybody. You're very welcome here. I'm Steph Newell from the English department here at Yale. It's my greatest pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker this evening, the Nobel Laureate Professor Abdulrazak Gurnah. Let me start with some thanks to our sponsors and organisers. Professor Gurnah's visit to Yale has been made possible by generous funding from the Council on African Studies at the Yale Macmillan Centre, as well as the Trumbull Endowed Lecture Fund, the Whitney Humanities Centre, the Office of the Dean of Humanities, and the English Department. Meanwhile, over several months, and with meticulous attention to detail, Kristin Siebert and Marwa Kabor of the Council on African Studies and the Yale Macmillan Centre have organised everything for Professor Gurnah's visit, from transportation to venues, to food, to drink, to much, much more. So Kristin and Marwa, wherever you are, there they are at the back. Please let's say thank you to them for all of their organisation. So our preparations have been supported all along the way by the Director of the Whitney Humanities Centre, Professor Alice Kaplan, and the Associate Director, Diane Barrett-Brown. And thanks also go to the Chair of the English Department, Mark Robinson, the Chair of the Council on African Studies, Professor Kajtana Heka, and the Dean of Humanities, Professor Katie Lofton. And they've all been very supportive. And we're also grateful to Jen Castellon and Michael Morand at the Beinecke Library. And you are all very warmly invited after this lecture to the Beinecke Library for a reception and a musical treat. We're also very grateful to the student helpers who are here to help out this afternoon. So now, as you may have gathered as you came in, your presence at this venue is an indication of your consent to the recording of that we're making of Professor Gurnah's lecture. So we'll have time for a short Q&A afterwards, but by putting your hands up and receiving the microphone, you're also implicitly agreeing, consenting to being recorded. We've also got a bookstall outside, which you may have seen on your way in. You're very welcome to buy copies of books, and Professor Gurnah has very kindly agreed to sign books after the lecture for a very short period of time. So welcome to you. And now, when Abdulrazak Gurnah was named winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2021, his publishers were caught off guard by the overnight upsurge in demand for his novels. And for a brief period, as supply caught up with demand, printed copies of his works vanished from the shelves. Bookshops struggled to restock, and the New York Times complained in a headline, "He won the Nobel, why are his books so hard to find?" Meanwhile, the reaction of literary scholars to Professor Gurnah's Nobel Prize was a noisy, "Of course." As the Sudanese-British author Leila Aboulela put it, she says, "Now our well-kept secret is out in the open." For more than 3 decades, Professor Gurnah has been an influential figure among post-colonial literary scholars. He's the author of 10 novels, numerous short stories, academic books, reflective essays, and scholarly articles. And as Professor of Literature at the University of Kent at Canterbury, his work has helped to shape our field. So when literary scholars think about the oceanic histories of East Africa, for example, and the old spice routes connecting Zanzibar with India and the Arab world, or when they think about the experiences of different kinds of migrants from Africa to the global north, they turn to his fiction. From the outset, with the publication of his first novel, Memory of Departure, in 1987, Professor Gurnah has focused on ordinary people caught up in momentous events in East Africa. So they're often set in Zanzibar, where he was born, but also in the neighbouring countries of Tanzania and Kenya. His novels feature characters whose lives are impacted by war, colonialism, decolonisation, but often who have little control over the events that shape their worlds. What horizons open and close, he asks, in the lives of ordinary Africans when they coincide with these seismic political transformations on the continent that are beyond their control? How do they navigate through violent events like European colonialism, world wars, fascism, displacement, revolutionary post-colonial conflict? In his Nobel Prize lecture, Professor Gurnah describes his creative writing as retrieving stories. And again, you can see this process of retrieval in his fiction. Whether it's an old man on his deathbed with a secret to disclose to his family, as in The Last Gift, or a young man who escapes domestic slavery into another form of servitude in the East African German army in First World War, as that's in his most recent novel, Afterlives, His work focuses on the figures whose experiences and feelings are either absent from the written archives or so thoroughly overwritten by colonial racial categories that their subjective experiences can't be recomposed from the historical record. As the narrator puts it in Afterlives, East Africa has simply been a sideshow to the great tragedies in Europe. In Professor Gurnah's fiction, you do not find a comfortable retrieval of stories into visibility. Many of his characters experience false memories, or sometimes their lies take on substance and become part of their family history, or new memories displace old ones, or stories become riddled with doubt. But, complicated as the stories and memories of his characters are, as their lives unfold in each novel, we see tangled accounts giving way to confessions, confusion and evasion giving way to clarification. Time and again in his novels, histories are corrected, memories are set right. Well, you find many different kinds of narrator in Professor Gurnah's novels, but you also find many different scenes of listening and examples of listeners as stories are told and retold. The way people and their stories are received is vital to his work. A failure to listen is shown to be another form of violence. You cannot imagine what that time was like, says the mother of the narrator of Gravelheart, as she tries yet again to describe the trauma of the January 1964 revolution in Zanzibar. You cannot imagine the terror of it, the arrests, the deaths, the humiliations. People were driving each other mad with rumours of new outrages, new decrees, with news of further sorrows. But yes, you can imagine, you must try. Nothing stands between us and atrocities but words, so there is no choice but to try and imagine. If you stop trying to tell your story, she continues, after a while it becomes as if these things did not really happen like that, as if you're exaggerating if you speak of them. So you stop speaking and they recede even further away. They become even more unreal, become even less possible to imagine. And you tell yourself it's time to move on. Let them go. It's not worth the bother of remembering. But they do not let you go. Like the listeners inside his stories, Abdulrazak Gurnah calls on us as readers, as listeners, to imagine, and in so doing, to inhabit and remember the lives of his characters. Tonight's lecture is called Writing Memory. Please welcome Professor Abdulrazak Gurnah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Steph. Thank you. That was a wonderful introduction. I couldn't have asked for better. And thank you all for being here. I'm very happy to be here. And to answer the question that I'm sure you're burning to get an answer to is, yes, it's the first time I'm coming to Yale. Okay. But it seems to be wherever you go, people say, is this the first time you're here? So, I like to get this out of the way as soon as possible. So yes, it is. Yes, it's good to be here. It's been relatively nice. A lot nicer than where we've come from in the UK. Anyway, really, Steph, thank you very much for that introduction, that appreciation. I've already met some of you. I met some of you yesterday, some of the students yesterday, and I know and have heard already from you. I'm so glad to see you again. Okay, so it's always interesting when you're invited to give a lecture, say, a year before the lecture is due to be given. And so we said, all right, what are you going to talk about? And, nothing's further away from your thoughts than this event that's going to happen a year hence. But I knew that this idea, this topic of memory, that it's something that I think about a lot and talk about and write about. So I thought this would be something that it might be interesting to put some ideas together and see what comes out. So for a writer, or at least for a writer of a certain kind, a writer like, I mean in that respect, not the person, but the kind of writing I do. So for a writer of that kind, the kind I'm familiar with, memory is a vital resource. I'm not referring to the ability to remember, when I say memory, to remember certain facts or details. But I'm referring to the swamp of memories that linger on long after the moment has passed, and which at times strike out of silence to leave one quivering with sorrow, and if one is lucky, with unexpected elation. I think of this idea of memory. This idea of memory is not facts or not remembered things exactly, but this kind of, I call it swamp, but you know what I mean, this kind of indefinable thing that lurks all the time there and every now and again surfaces and catches you. I think of this idea of memory as a writer's hinterland, in the sense that large urban centers depend on the country around them to provide the means to sustain them. I use this word to describe memory, and somebody said, "Why do you want to use a German word?" I said, no, hinterland is not a German word. Didn't you do O-level geography or something like that? But another way of speaking, the hinterland in the sense of it provides the source material, the place where the writer goes back to for to kind of check the plausibility of certain notions and ideas and that sort of thing. But another way of speaking about memory is to describe it as experience. We remember what we have experienced, and we do so in a profound sense of that word, experience. Now, there may be events, experience may be events which befell us in person, or stories we heard about other people and other places, or news, or histories we read about, or dreams and imaginings that thrilled, that thrilled or baffled us. I think of experience as all of those things. This is what goes on in our consciousness, both because we live it, because we hear about it, because we read about it, or in other ways we imagine it, we anticipate it because of what we already know. It's the writer's self-inflicted burden to make something engaging, productive, or even beautiful out of this. The recall of memory in writing performs several of these functions that I've been touching on. It engages, the recalling of memory in writing engages by evoking salient details. It makes the engagement productive because we believe in it. We find it plausible. And we hear echoes of it in our own knowledge. There's all this lovely moment when you're reading something and you kind of, without being aware, and you're nodding because you think, yes. Because we're hearing something that is both persuasive, but also because we recognize something. And if the writer has been blessed with the ability and insight, the product is even beautiful. So you not only nod and say that, but you think, oh gosh, that's good. How did he do that? We read for comparably complex ends. There is pleasure in the engagement itself. I would have thought that's probably the primary part of the experience of reading. It doesn't work if there isn't that. So there is pleasure in the engagement, which is difficult to describe, but which is palpable, which is something we can feel when we feel it. That pleasure, it seems to me, is, as I just mentioned, primary, unless, of course, if we're in the midst of a university literature program. We see our inclinations and ideas expressed more persuasively than we are capable of doing ourselves. We're exposed to places and times and ways of thinking, some of which are familiar and some completely unfamiliar. In other words, in addition to the pleasure of reading something beautifully or powerfully expressed, we also receive news. We learn. The least of these functions that I've been trying to summarize is, if you like, why do we read? or what do we get out of reading, the least of these functions, which the recall of memory in writing performs, is to evoke nostalgia for a lost time. To speak a lament for a contentment which is no longer possible. Nostalgia in this sense would seem to refer to a kind of self-deception, an introspective desire to see what is past more positively than the present state. And as scholars and students of literature, we are often skeptical of such tropes. Indeed, we are trained to be skeptical. And there are good reasons for this, both in reading literature and in living our lives. Because at worst, sentiment can also be a means of evasion, a refusal to acknowledge responsibility for what was done in our name. On the other hand, let's not be in a hurry to throw out this word, nostalgia. You can find this out by just checking on Google. The word nostalgia derives from the Greek words nostos, which means return, and algos, which means pain. And one of its meanings is the distress aroused by a yearning for one's place of origin. It's a yearning that those who have lost their places of origin, who have lost their homes, know only too well. In recent times, we have witnessed a strange panic in Europe about the arrival of what are described as refugees. You are familiar with that panic in this country as well. But I'll restrict my remarks to Europe in order to avoid homogenizing complicated issues, which is one of the problems of the representation of people on the move. It has become common to refer to all arrivals from outside of Europe as refugees, when perhaps more nuanced terms would enable us to see the phenomenon of displacement and migration more clearly. The use of this word in reference to the population upheavals of non-European people is inflected with criminal and malicious intention and subsequent social jeopardy for the destination country. More often than not, it is emptied of the threat to life and the desperate distress that prompted the flight in the first place. Refugees are not a new phenomenon for Europe or for anywhere else in the world. But for Europe, which has been convulsed in relentless wars on its own soil for centuries, is even less of an unknown phenomenon. These movements were not only within Europe, but large ones to North and South America, the victims of economic and social distress on the move. Even larger numbers of Europeans went or were sent to what we now call the Global South. These were not refugees, or they were not all refugees, but people empowered, at times involuntarily, by the expansionist ideologies of their states, to displace and dispossess non-European people of their rights and their lands, and at times their lives, and to call this process a civilizing mission. The incredible destruction of the 20th century wars saw not only the pulverization of prosperous and densely populated cities and territories, but an unprecedented forced transfer of people. What else is a refugee but a creature on the move as a result of such circumstances? When we speak of such a figure, we should remind ourselves that the European colonization of the continents was also a deprivation of the rights and lands of native peoples, some of whom now have no recourse but to seek the safety and prosperity which their oppression has produced. How should we begin to think about the human obligation in this phenomenon? What are we to do? To me, it seems both a moral and human obligation to offer hospitality. To people whose lives are at risk, and indeed to avoid criminalizing a desire for safety and self-fulfillment. I began by speaking about memory as a vital resource of a certain kind of writer, or for a certain kind of writer, and I will return to that presently in the light of the representation and the self-representation of the displaced figure. Recently, in my tour of the world, I was asked to speak in the same way, like this, like I mentioned at the beginning. Will you give? Actually, I wasn't even asked. I was told you're giving the inaugural address in about 2 hours, and your topic is like that. It happens, honestly. But this time, my topic was writing as a form of resistance. Talk about that. My first instinct was to resist. Because I thought this was one of those platform statements or overstatements. Literature is the meaning of life, that kind of self-congratulation that commentators and practitioners of the writing business are sometimes prone to. But I had to speak to people to whom this subject had already been announced. So there was no escape. So I rephrased the topic for myself. If writing is a form of resistance, what is it resistant to? In the first place, I think, resistance to forgetfulness. When oppressions and tragedies befall people at the hands of powerful forces, and what is known and believed in can no longer be known and believed in the same way, the compulsion is to move on, to get on with it, to forget. Precisely the passage you quoted, although I didn't know you were going to do that. It's a compulsion endorsed by those responsible for such events who would prefer that we do forget, that we do not remember what led to our present state. A few years ago, a British Prime Minister on a visit to Tanzania was exasperated by a question about colonialism. And he was reported to reply, "Why are you talking about colonialism? It's over. Forget about it and let's move on." It was Gordon Brown, actually. Our own governments would also like us to forget about their atrocities too and move on. And in many instances, citizens have no choice but to do so in order to preserve life and decency. But writers do have a choice. They can choose not to allow what they know and what they remember to pass away unnoticed. Writing is not only about noble and brave ideas and acts. It is not necessarily about fighting tyrants or necessarily about standing on platforms and making powerful speeches to energize people. It's about the ordinary, mundane business of keeping alive what is important, which is about how people imagine themselves and how they see and describe the world they live in. In an important way, I think there is a kind of responsibility in that. Writing is resistance to distortion by narratives that seek to justify injustice, to distract us from what our minds should be focusing on, to draw us to other things that might appear at first more appealing, or more interesting, or more immediate. It is resistance, in other words, to neglect. And it is important to continue to uphold those ideas and beliefs that we think are important and that we value. You get the picture, I hope. It's about remembering. A while ago, I referred to the way recollections of a lost time are taken to be sentimental and suspect, and nostalgia. I suggested that we hang on to that word, at least in its sense of the distress aroused by a yearning for one's place of origin. I said earlier that it is a yearning of those who have lost their homes know only too well. Towards the end of his memoir, Out of Place, Edward Said says, I quote, "To this day, I feel that since I'm quoting, but I get it exactly right, huh? To this day, I still feel that I'm away from home." I would like to dwell on that for a moment, on what constitutes the ongoing memory of what has been lost and how some writers have coped with that. Said has written in a variety of ways about that experience. Nuruddin Farah, the eminent Somali writer, has only ever written about Somalia in his 11 novels, even though he has not lived in Somalia for any length of time since 1970. I'm concentrating mainly on writers from, shall we say, the global south, but because one can think of others as well. Joyce, for example. Nabokov, another example. But anyway, let's stay with our community. In his brilliant early poems, Kamau Brathwaite has the figure of the itinerant Caribbean man, whom he describes thus in the poem Folkways. "Ever seen a man travel more, seen more lands than this poor, landless, harborless spade?" Brathwaite poses that as a question. Ever seen anyone like him? He poses that as a question, and in a way it was true to his own life, which he spent largely away from his home island, Barbados. But he always wrote about the Caribbean. And he returned there in his last days to live and die at Cow Pastor, Christchurch, Barbados. A place he described, I quote, "my maroon town, resistance Palenque." Palenque is the ancient Maya city in southern Mexico, and its invocation with reference to cow pastor or cow pasture. We're getting both. This is typical of Brathwaite, the slash. It's this, it's that. So sometimes cow pastor, sometimes it's cow pasture. But the invocation of the reference to Palenque, the reference to cow pastor, cow pasture, is part of Brathwaite's lifelong idea of a new world vision for the Caribbean, a vision whose force derived from an embrace and imaginative transformation of the Caribbean, the tragic history of the Caribbean slavery and plantation. Derek Walcott in Schooner Flight has his Shabin utter the famous lines celebrating Caribbean diversity. I quote, "Either I'm nobody or I'm a nation." Before later on ennobling that diversity by casting the Caribbean man as a Homeric hero in search of his place in the world. The Guyanese novelist Wilson Harris set all of his 22 novels in Guyana, even though he lived most of his adult life in Colchester, just outside London. And of course, Jean Rhys, who in her 60s returned to the Dominica of her childhood to write White Sagacious Sea. So what is it about place that has this incredible grip on the writer's imagination? What is it that makes it so difficult to give up the force of its memory? Isn't one place as good as another in the end? The causes of the impulse to disperse, to leave home, often have similar sources: an injustice, terror, disgust, or need. And while refugee appears to be a word with a firm and clear idea of its reference, it includes the terrified Rohingya child and the young African man recklessly risking everything for a life in Europe. It includes the religious persecuted and the victims of war and imperial aggression. I think that what makes it impossible to give up this memory of place is an unredeemed injustice, an unappeased longing, where to abandon an obligation to place and people seems like treachery. However ineffectual and self-tormenting such memorializing might seem to a practical-minded person, the impulse to do so is unavoidable, because to do otherwise, to forget, would seem like self-indulgent neglect. Thank you very much.